Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Beyond Shakespeare podcast live. I'm your host, Robert Crichton, and hopefully this is working. I am at the mercy of rural broadband. This is being recorded separately as well, so if this is all a terrible disaster, this recording will still be available in about 90 minutes' time from 12:30. I'm just going to go through a few bits of back and forth before I go into the reading of The Wonderful Year by Thomas Dekker, as I need to just make sure that the stream is vaguely working. If you cannot hear me, which is a rather silly thing to say, please say something in the comments, or if you're having any massive problems with what I'm producing at the moment. There's very little I can do if you can't get the stream properly. Just be aware you can't see me. You shouldn't be able to see me. There is no picture available apart from the logo. So I'm just going to have a little turn around in my chair to look and see what the internet is doing. And everything seems to be going fine, which is lovely and marvellous. We seem to have a good signal, and nobody's shouting, "Where's the feed? Where's the feed? Where's the feed?" So as I say, my name's Robert Crichton. I am going to be doing live streaming of these readings of texts from early modern pamphlets or poems or books. And if you want me to read something in the coming weeks, I will be available to do so. The important thing, if you have any suggestions or any thoughts about what you want, just be aware that we are limited to what we can get a copy of online so that I can share it, so that people can follow along with it. And also just simply the quality of that. So just be aware of that. If you have any suggestions or anything you desperately want reading, also for that matter, anything that is several million words long, then maybe not. Maybe that's a bit of an issue. Today's final part is the final part of Thomas Dekker's The Wonderful Year. Trigger warning before we go into this. These are all stories now of plague. The first two parts, which are available backed up on my Patreon page for the Beyond Shakespeare podcast, they're backed up. They're free to access for everyone. A lot of the Patreon content is only for patrons. But in this case, it's all open so that you can go back and have a listen to that in the future. Still have a good signal. Marvellous. So the first two parts, covered, in a sense, an overview of the year 1603, which was very eventful. It was wonderful in the sense of not so much wonder of lovely, nice things, which is how we see the word wonderful today, but more as things that are wondrous and potentially confusing or upsetting or just eventful. And so 1603 saw the death of Queen Elizabeth I and the fears of succession that brought about through the kingdom. And then everyone relaxes and thinks, no, James is fine, everything's okay, everyone's suddenly happy again, they're trying to make money. And then the calamity of plague arrives. And the last episode covered the very real, satirical, and also lamentable aspects of that. This final part is essentially a collection of stories about people encountering the plague, of which there's a disclaimer at the beginning of the book, which basically says these stories may or may not be true. They may be exaggerated. I've just heard them on the wind, and that's what we're entering now. So it doesn't matter if you haven't listened to what came before. You can enjoy Thomas Dekker's prose. And this is all in prose. You can go to, there's a link in the comments. I put in a link to read the text if you want to read along. It can be a bit dense, and sometimes it's not always easy to follow at a first listen, but I'm going to endeavour to make sure that it is clear for you at home. As this is live, I may trip. It is in early modern prose. That is quite tricky to do. There are occasional bits of Latin, which I will inevitably do very, very badly. Feel free to feel smug about my inadequacies there. Now, tomorrow we're not going to be broadcasting at lunchtime, 12:30 Greenwich Mean Time, because of sorting out the commissariat during the time of plague. I am needed elsewhere at that time. Self-isolating has its own schedules. But we will be live with Kemp's 9 Days Wonder at 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So Kemp's 9 Days Wonder, I'm going to do the whole of that wonderful pamphlet about Kemp doing his Morris dance over a series of 9 days from London to Norwich. So that should be good fun. It's a different kind of wonder. It generally is wonderful and fun and light and frothy. So, that is all the blather that goes into this. Now, the other live streams that I'm hoping to do in the future, or delayed live streams, will be readings of plays. We're working on that at the moment. It's something we do on the podcast all the time, but normally with people in the same room. With a lot of people self-isolating at the moment, we're hoping to do some online recordings of plays you've probably never heard before, which should be really, really fun and exciting. If you are interested in those, keep an eye on the Twitter account at Beyond Shakes. But without further ado, I will now go into part 3 of The Wonderful Year by Thomas Dekker. And now, stories. Comical and ridiculous stuff, others lamentable, upholding rather admiration than laughter or pity. As first to relish the palate of liquorish expectation, and withal to give an item how suddenly a stabber this ruffianly swaggerer death is, you must believe that amongst all the weary number of those that on their bare feet have travailed in this long and heavy vocation to the Holy Land, one whose name I could for need bestow upon you, but that I know you have no need of it, though many want a good name, lying in that common inns of sick men his bed, and seeing the black and blue stripes of the plague sticking on his flesh, which he received as tokens from heaven, that he was presently to go dwell in the upper world, which most earnestly requested, and in a manner conjured his friend who came to interchange a last farewell, that he would see him go handsomely attired into the wild Irish country of Worms, and for that purpose to bestow a coffin upon him, his friend loving him not because he was poor, yet he was poor, but because he was a scholar. Alack that the West Indies stand so far from universities, and that a mind richly apparelled should have a threadbare body, made faithful promise to him that he should be nailed up. He would board him, and for that purpose went instantly to one of the new-found trade of coffin cutters, bespoke one, and, like the surveyor of death's buildings, gave direction how this little tenement should be framed, paying all the rent for it beforehand. But note upon what slippery ground life goes. Little did he think to dwell in that room himself, which he had taken for his friend. Yet it seemed the common law of mortality had so decreed, for he was called into the cold company of his grave an hour before his infected friend, and had a long lease even till doomsday in the same lodging, which in the strength of health he went to prepare for another. What credit, therefore, is to be given to breath, which like an harlot will run away with every minute? How nimble is sickness, and what skill hath he in all the weapons he plays withal? The greatest cutter that takes up the Mediterranean isle in Paul's for his gallery to wake in cannot ward off his blows. He's the best fencer in the world. Vincentio Saviolo is nobody to him. He has his mandrites, imbracantes, stammazones, and stoccates at his fingers' ends. He'll make you give him ground, though ye were never worth foot of land, and beat you out of breath, though Aeolus himself played upon your windpipe. To witness which, I will call forth a Dutchman. Yet, now he's past calling for, has lost his hearing, for his ears by this time are eaten off with worms, who, though he dwelt in Bedlam, was not mad, yet the looks of the plague, which indeed are terrible, put him almost out of his wits, for then the snares of this cunning hunter, the pestilence, were but newly laid, and yet laid, as my Dutchman smelt it out well enough, to trap poor men's lives that meant him no hurt. Away sneaks my clipper of the King's English, and because musket shot should not reach him, to the Low Countries that are built upon butter firkins and Holland cheese sails this plaguy fugitive. But death, who hath more authority there than all the 7 electors, and to show him that there were other low country besides his own, takes a little Frokin, one of my Dutch runaways' children, and sends her packing. Into those Netherlands she departed. Oh, how pitifully looked my burgomaster when he understood that the sickness could swim. It was an easy matter to escape the Dunkirks, but death's galleys made out after him swifter than the great Turks, which he, perceiving, made no more ado, but drunk to the states 5 or 6 healths, because he would be sure to live well, and back again comes he, to try the strength of English beer. His old rendezvous of madmen was the place of meeting, where he was no sooner arrived, but the plague had him by the back, and arrested him upon an exat regnum for running to the enemy. So that for the mad tricks he played to cozen our English worms of his Dutch carcass, which had been fatted here, sickness and death clapped him up in Bedlam the 2nd time. And there he lies, and there he shall lie till he rot, before I'll meddle any more with him. But being got out of Bedlam, let us make a journey to Bristow, having taken an honest known citizen along with us, who, with other company travelling thither, only for fear the air of London should conspire to poison him, setting up his rest not to hear the sound of Bow Bell till next Christmas, was notwithstanding in the highway singled out from his company, and set upon by the plague, who bade him stand and deliver his life. The rest at that word shifted for themselves, and went on. He, amazed to see his friends fly, and not being able to defend himself, for who can defend himself meeting such an enemy, yielded, and being but 40 miles from London, used all the sleights he could to get loose out of the hands of death, and so to hide himself in his own house, whereupon he called for help at the same inn where not long before he and his fellow pilgrims obtained for their money, marry yet with more prayers than a beggar makes in 3 terms, to stand and drink some 30 foot from the door. To this house of tippling iniquity he repairs again, conjuring the Lars or walking sprites in it, if it were Christmas, that if was well put in, and in the name of God to succour and rescue him to their power out of the hands of infection which now assaulted his body. The devil would have been afraid of this conjuration, but they were not yet afraid. They were, it seemed, for presently the doors had their wooden ribs crushed in pieces by being drawn together. The casements were shut more close than in usurer's greasy velvet pouch. The drawing windows were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not a crevice but was stopped, not a mouse hole left open, for all the holes in the house were most wickedly dammed up. Mine host and hostess ran over one another into the backside, the maids into the orchard, quivering and quaking and ready to hang themselves on the innocent plum trees. For the tapster, he fled into the cellar, rapping out 5 or 6 plain country oaths that he would drown himself in a most villainous stand of ale if the sick Londoner stood at the door any longer. But stand there he must, for to go away, well, he cannot, but continues knocking and calling in a faint voice which in their ears sounded as if it were some staring ghost in a tragedy had exclaimed upon Rhadamanth. He might knock till his hands skite and call his heart ache, for they were in a worse pickle within than he was without. He being in a good way to heaven, they being so frighted that they scarce knew whereabout heaven stood, only they all cried out, "Lord, have mercy upon us!" Yet Lord have mercy upon us was the only thing they feared. The doleful catastrophe of all is, a bed could not be had for all Babylon, not a cup of drink, nor cold water be gotten, though it had been for Alexander the Great. If a draught of aqua vitae might have saved his soul, the town denied to do God that good service. What misery continues ever, the poor man standing thus at death's door, and looking every minute when he should be let in. Behold, another Londoner, that had likewise been in the frigider zona of the country, and was returning, like an heir of hell, to the heaven of his own home, makes a stand at this sight, to play the physician, and seeing the complexion of his patient, that he was sick at heart, applies to his soul the best medicines that his comforting speech could make, for there dwelt no apothecary near enough to help his body. Being therefore driven out of all other shifts, he leads him into a pillow, a bundle of straw, which with much ado he bought for money, serving instead of a pillow. But the destinies, hearing the diseased party complain and take on because he lay in a field bed, when before he had been glad of a mattress, for very spite cut the thread of his life, the cruelty of which deed made the other that played charity's part at his wit's end, because he knew not where to purchase 10 foot of ground for his grave. The church nor churchyard would let none of their lands. Master Vicar was struck dumb, and could not give the dead a good word. Neither clerk nor sexton could be hired to execute their office. No, they themselves would first be executed, so that he that had never handled shovel before got his implements about him, ripped up the belly of the earth, and made it like a grave, stripped the cold carcass, bound his shirt about his feet, pulled a linen nightcap over his eyes, and so laid him in the rotten bed of the earth, covering him with clothes cut out of the same piece. And learning, by his last words, his name and habitation, this sad traveller arrives at London, delivering to the amazed widow and children, instead of a father and a husband, only the outside of him, his apparel. But by the way, note one thing. The bringer of these heavy tidings, as if he had lived long enough when so excellent a work of piety and pity was by him finished, the very next day after his coming home, departed out of this world, to receive his reward in the spiritual court of heaven. It is plain, therefore, by the evidence of these 2 witnesses, that death, like a thief, sets upon men in the highway, dogs them into their own houses, breaks into their bedchambers by night, assaults them by day, and yet no law can take hold of him. He devours man and wife, offers violence to their fair daughters, kills their youthful sons, and deceives them of their servants. Yea, so full of treachery is he grown since this plague took his part, that no lovers dare trust him, nor by their good wills would come near him, for he works their downfall even when their delights are not at the highest. Too ripe a proof have we of this in a pair of lovers. The maid was in the pride of fresh blood and beauty. She was that which to be now is a wonder, young and yet chaste. The gifts of her mind were great, yet those which fortune bestowed upon her, as being well descended, were not much inferior. On this lovely creature did a young man so steadfastly fix his eye, that her looks kindled in his bosom a desire, whose flames burnt the more brightly, because they were fed with sweet and modest thoughts. Hymen was the god to whom he prayed day and night that he might marry her. His prayers were received at length. After many tempests of her denial and frowns of her kinsfolk, the element grew clear, and he saw the happy landing place, where he had long sought to arrive. The prize of her youth was made his own, and the solemn day appointed when it should be delivered to him. Glad of which blessedness, for to a lover it is a blessedness, he wrought by all the possible art he could use to shorten the expected hour. And bringing it nearer, for whether he feared the interception of parents, or that his own soul with excessive joy was drowned in strange passions, he would often, with sighs mingled with kisses, and kisses half sinking in tears, prophetically tell her that sure he should never live to enjoy her. To discredit which opinion of his, behold, the sun had made fast, and awakened the bridal morning. Now does he call his heart traitor, that did so falsely conspire against him. Lively blood leapeth into his cheeks. He's got up, and gaily attired to play the bridegroom. She likewise does as cunningly turn herself into a bride. Kindred and friends are met together. Sops and Muscadine run sweating up and down till they drop again to comfort their hearts. And because so many coffins pestered London churches that there was no room left for weddings, coaches are provided, and away rides all the train into the country. On a Monday morning are the lusty lovers on their journey, and before noon are they alighted, entering instead of an inn, for more state, into a church, where they no sooner appeared but the priest fell to his business. The holy knot was a-tying, but he that should fasten it, coming to this, in sickness and in health, there he stopped, for suddenly the bride took hold of in sickness, for in health all that stood by and were in fear she should never be kept. The maiden blush, into which her cheeks were lately dyed, now began to lose colour. Her voice like a coward would have shrunk away, but that her lover, reaching her a hand, which he brought thither to give her, for he was not yet made a full husband, did with that touch somewhat revive her. On they again went so far, till they met with for better, for worse. There was she worse than before, and had not only the holy officer made haste, the ground on which she stood to be married might easily have been broken up for her burial. All ceremonies being finished, she was led between two, not like a bride, but rather like a corse, to her bed. That bed must now be the table on which the wedding dinner is to be served up, being at this time nothing but tears and sighs and lamentation, and death is chief waiter. Yet at length her weak heart, wrastling with the pangs, gave them a fall, so that up she stood again, and in the fatal funeral coach that carried her forth, she was brought back as upon a bier to the city. But see the malice of her enemy that had her in chase. Upon the Wednesday following, being overtaken, was her life overcome. Death rudely lay with her, and spoiled her of a maidenhead in spite of her husband. Oh, the sorrow that did round beset him now. Was his divination true? She was a wife, yet continued a maid. He was a husband and a widower, yet never knew his wife. She was his own, yet he had her not. She had him, yet never enjoyed him. Here is a strange alteration, for the rosemary that was washed in sweet water to set out the bridal is now wet in tears to furnish her burial. The music that was heard to sound forth dances can now be heard for ringing of bells. All the comfort that happened to either side being this, that he lost her before she had time to be an ill wife, and she left him ere he was able to be a bad husband. Better fortune had this bride to fall into the hands of the plague than one other of that frail female sex, whose picture is next to be drawn, had to scape out of them. An honest cobbler, if at least cobblers can be honest, they live altogether amongst wicked souls. An honest cobbler had a wife who, in the time of health, treading her shoe often awry, determined in the agony of a sickness, which this year had a saying to her, to fall to mending as well as her husband did. The bed that she lay upon, being, as she thought, or rather feared, the last bed that would ever bear her, for many other beds had borne her, you must remember, and the worm of sin tickling her conscience, up she calls her very innocent and simple husband out of his virtuous shop, where, like justice, he sat distributing amongst the poor to some halfpenny pieces, penny pieces to some, and twopenny pieces to others, so long as they would last. His provident care being always that every man and woman should go upright. To the bedside of his plaguy wife approacheth Monsieur Cobbler, to understand what deadly news she had to tell him, and the rest of his kind neighbours that were assembled, such thick tears standing in both the gutters of his eyes to see his beloved lie in such a pickle, that in their salt water all his utterance was drowned, which he perceiving, wept as fast as he. But by the warm counsel that sat about the bed, the showers ceased, she wiping her cheeks with the corner of the sheets, and he his sullied face with his leathern apron. At last 2 or 3 sighs, ah, ah, like a chorus to the tragedy ensuing, ah, stepping out first, wringing her hands, which gave the better action, she told the pitiful Actaeon, her husband, that she had often done him wrong. He only shook his head at this, and cried, which, she taking as the watchword of his true patience, unravelled the bottom of her frailty at length, and concluded that with such a man, and named him, but I hope you would not have me follow her steps and name him too, she practised the universal and common art of grafting, and that upon her good man's head they too had planted a monstrous pair of invisible horns. At the sound of the horns, my cobbler started up like a March hare, and began to look wild. His all never ran through the sides of a boot, as that word did through his heart. But being a politic cobbler, and remembering what piece of work he was to underlay, stroking his beard, like some grave headborough of the parish, and giving a nod, as who should say, "Go on," bade her go on indeed, clapping to her sore soul this general salve, that all are sinners and must forgive, etc. for he hoped by such wholesome physic as shoemakers' wax being laid to a bile, to draw out all the corruption of her secret villainies. She, good heart, being tickled under gills with the finger of these kind speeches, turns up the white of her eye and fetches out another. Another? Oh, that thou art trained up in nothing but to handle pieces. Another hath discharged his artillery against thy castle of fortification. Here was a passion predominant. Vulcan struck the colour's ghost, for he was now no cobbler, but so hardy upon his breast that he cried, "Oh!" His neighbours, taking pity to see what terrible stitches pulled him, rubbed his swelling temples with the juice of patience, which, by virtue of the blackish sweat that stood reeling on his brows and had made them supple, entered very easily into his now parlous, understanding skull, so that he left, wenching, and sat, quiet as a lamb, falling to his old vomit of counsel which he had cast up before, and swearing, because he was in strong hope this shoe should wring him no more, to seal her a general acquittance. Pricked forward with this gentle spur, her tongue mends his pace, so that in her confession she overtook others whose boots had been set all night on the cobbler's last, bestowing upon him the posy of their names, the time and place, to the intent it might be put into his next wife's wedding ring. And although she had made all these blots in his tables, yet the bearing of one man false, whom she had not discovered, struck more in her stomach than all the rest. "O valiant cobbler," cries out one of the auditors, "how art thou set upon, how art thou tempted? Happy art thou that thou art not in thy shop, for instead of cutting out pieces of leather, thou wouldst doubtless now pare away thy heart. For I see, and so do all thy neighbours here, thy wife's ghostly fathers, see that a small matter would now cause thee to turn Turk and to meddle with no more patches, but to live within the compass of thy wit. Lift not up thy collar. Be not horn mad. Thank heaven that the murder is revealed. Study thou Balthazar's part in Geronimo, for thou hast more cause, though less reason, than he, to be glad and sad. Well, I see thou art worthy to have patient Grizzled to thy wife, for thou bearest more than she. Thou showest thyself to be a right cobbler, and no souter, that canst thus cleanly clout up the seam-rent sides of thy affection." With this learned oration the cobbler was tutored, laid his finger on his mouth, and cried, "Porcos palabros!" He sealed her pardon, and therefore bid her not fear. Hereupon she named the malefactor. I could name him too, but he shall live to give more cobblers' heads the bastinado. And told that on such a night when he supped there, for a lord may sup with a cobbler that hath a pretty wench to his wife, when the cloth, oh treacherous linen, was taken up, and Menelaus had for a parting blow given the other his fist, down she lights this half-sharer, opening the wicket, but not shutting him out of the wicket, but conveys him into a by-room, being the wardrobe of old shoes and leather, from whence the unicorn cobbler, that dreamt of no such spirits, being over head and ears in sleep, his snorting giving the sign that he was cocksure, softly outsteals Sir Paris, and to Helen's teeth proved himself a true Trojan. This was the cream of her confusion, which being skimmed off from the stomach of her conscience, we looked every minute to go thither, where he should be far enough out of the cobbler's reach. But the fates, laying their heads together, sent a reprieve. The plague that before meant to pepper her, by little and little, left her company. Which news being blown abroad, oh, lamentable! Never did the old buskin tragedy begin till now. For the wise of those husbands with whom she had played at fast and loose came with nails sharpened for the nonce like cats, and tongues forked cut like the stings of adders, first to scratch out false Cressid's eyes, and then, which was worse, to worry her to death with scolding. But the matter was took up in a tavern, the case was altered and brought to a new reckoning. Marry, the blood of the Bordeaux grape was first shed about it, but in the end all anger on every side was poured into a pot, and there burnt to death. Now, whether this recantation was true, or whether the steam of infection, fuming up like wine into her brains, made her talk thus idly, I leave it to the jury. And whilst they are canvassing her case, let us see what doings the sexton of Stepney hath, whose warehouses being all full of dead commodities, saving one, that one he left open a whole night, yet it was half full too, knowing the thieves this year were too honest to break into such cellars. Besides, those that are left there had such plaguy pates that none durst meddle with them for their lives. About 12 of the clock at midnight, when spirits walk, and not a mouse dare stirring, because cats go a-caterwauling, Sin, that all day durst not show his head, came reeling out of an alehouse in the shape of a drunkard, who no sooner smelt the wind, but he thought the ground under him danced the canaries. Houses seemed to turn on the toe, and all things went around, insomuch that his legs drew a pair of indentures between his body and the earth. The principal covenant being that he, for his part, would stand to nothing whatever he saw. Every tree that came in his way he did jessel, and yet challenge it to the next day, to fight with him. If he had clipped but a quarter so much of the king's silver as he did of the king's English, his carcass had long ere this been carrion for crows. But he lived by gaming, and had excellent casting, yet seldom won. For he drew reasonable good hands, but had very bad feet that were not able to carry it away. This setter-up of Maltman, being troubled with the staggers, fell into the self-same grave that stood gaping wide open for a breakfast next morning, and imagining, when he was in the grave, that he had stumbled into his own house, and that all his bedfellows, as they were indeed, were in their dead sleep. He, never complaining of cold, nor calling for more sheet, soundly takes a nap till he snorts again. In the morning the sexton comes plodding along, and casting upon his fingers' ends what he hopes the dead pay of that day will come to, by that which he received the day before, for shrugging his shoulders together he steps for sextons now had better doings than either taverns or bawdy houses. In that silver contemplation, shrugging his shoulders together, he steps ere he be aware on the brims of that pit into which this worshipper of Bacchus was fallen, where, finding some dead men's bones and a skull or two that lay scattered here and there, before he looked into this coffer of worms, those he takes up, and flings them in. One of the skulls battered the sconce of the sleeper, whilst the bones played with his nose, whose blows, waking his musty worship, the first word that he cast up was an oath, and thinking the cans had flown about, cried, "Zounds! What do you mean to crack my mazer?" The sexton, smelling a voice, fear being stronger than his heart, believed verily some of the corses spake to him, upon which, feeling himself in a cold sweat, took his heels, whilst the goblin scrambled up and ran after him. But it appears the sexton had the lighter foot, for he ran so fast that he ran out of his wits, which being left behind him, he had like to have died presently after. A merrier bargain than the poor sexton's did a tinker meet withal in a country town, through which a citizen of London being driven, to keep himself under the lee shore in this tempestuous contagion, and casting his eye for some harbour, spied a bush at the end of a pole, the ancient badge of a country alehouse, into which, as good luck was, without any resistance of the barbarians that all this year used to keep such landing places, veiling his bonnet, he struck in. The host had been a mad Greek. Marry, he could now speak nothing but English. A good fat burgher he was, with a belly arching out like a beer barrel, which made his legs, that were thick and short, like two piles driven under London Bridge, to straddle half as wide as the top of Paul's, which, upon my knowledge, hath been burnt twice or thrice. A leathern pouch hung at his side that opened and shut with a snap-hots, and was indeed a flask for gunpowder when King Henry went to Boulogne. An antiquary might have picked rare matter out of his nose, but that it was worm-eaten, yet that proved it to be an ancient nose. In some corners of it there were bluish holes that shone like shells of mother-of-pearl, and to do his nose right, pearls had been gathered out of them. Others were richly garnished with rubies, chrysolites, and carbuncles, which glistered so orientally that the Hamburgers offered I know not how many dollars for his company in the East Indian voyage, to have stood a nights in the poop of their admiral, only to save the charge of candles. In conclusion, he was an host to be led before an emperor, and though he were one of the greatest men in all the shire, his bigness made him not proud, but he humbled himself to speak the base language of a tapster, and upon the Londoners presently, with a new cake and a can, the room voided and the guest left, like a French lord, attended by nobody, who, drinking half a can in conceit to the health of his best friend in the city, which lay extreme sick, and never more need of health, I know not what qualms came over this man's stomach, but immediately he fell down, without uttering any more words, and never rose again. Anon, as it was his fashion, enters my puffing host to relieve with a fresh supply out of his cellar the shrinking can, if he perceived it stood in danger to be overthrown. But seeing the chief leader dropped at his feet, and imagining at first he was but wounded a little in the head, held up his gouty goals and blessed himself that a Londoner, who would want to be the most valiant rob-pots, should now be struck down only with 2 hoops, and thereupon jogged him, sembled out these comfortable words of a soldier, "If thou be a man, stand thy legs." He stirred not for all this, whereupon the maids, being raised, as it had been with a hue and cry, came hobbling into the room like a flock of geese, and having, upon search of the body, given up this verdict, that the man was dead and murdered by the plague. Oh, daggers to all their hearts that heard it. Away trudged the wenches, and one of them, having but had a freckled face all her lifetime, was persuaded presently that they now were the tokens, and had liked to have turned up her heels upon it. My gore-belly host, that in many a year could not without grunting crawl over a threshold but 2 foot broad, leapt half a yard from the course, it was measured by a carpenter's rule, as nimbly as if his guts had been taken out by the hangman. Out of the house he wallowed presently, being followed with 2 or 3 dozen of napkins to dry up the lard that ran so fast down his heels, that all the way he went was more greasy than a kitchen-stuffed wife's basket. You could have sworn It had been a barrel of pitch on fire if you had looked upon him, for such a smoky cloud, by reason of his own fat hot steam, compassed him round, that but for his voice he had been lost in that stinking mist. Hanged himself had without all question in this pitiful taking, but that he feared the weight of his intolerable paunch would have burst the rope, and so he would have been put to a double death. At length the town was razed, the country came down upon him, and yet not upon him neither, for after they understood the tragedy, every man gave ground, knowing my pursy ale cunner could not follow them. What is to be done in this strange alarum? The whole village is in danger to lie at the mercy of God, and shall be bound to curse none but him for it. They should do well, therefore, to set his house on fire before the plague scape out of it, lest it forage higher than the country, and knock them down, man, woman, and child, like oxen, whose blood, they all swear, shall be required at his hands. At these speeches my tender-hearted host fell down on his marrow bones, meaning, indeed, to entreat his audience to be good to him. But they, fearing he had been peppered too, as well as the Londoner, tumbled one upon another, and were ready to break their necks for haste to be gone. Yet some of them, being more valiant than the rest, because they heard him roar out for some help, very desperately stepped back, and with rakes and pitchforks lifted the gulch from the ground, concluding, after they had laid their hogsheads together, to draw out some wholesome counsel, that whosoever should venture upon the dead man and bury him should have 40 shillings out of the common town purse, though it would be a great cut to it, with the love of the church wardens and sidemen doing the term of life. This was proclaimed, but none durst appear to understand the dreadful execution. They loved money well, marry the plague, hanging over any man's head that should meddle with it in that sort. They all vowed to die beggars before it should be chronicled they killed themselves for 40 shillings. And in that brave resolution, every one with bag and baggage marched home, barricadoing their doors and windows with fir bushes, fern, and bundles of straw, to keep out pestilence at the stave's end. At last, a tinker came sounding through the town, mine host's house being the ancient watering place where he did use to cast anchor. You must understand, he was none of those base rascally tinkers that with ban-dog and a drab at their tails and pike-staff on their necks will take a purse sooner than stop a kettle. No, he was a devout tinker. He did honour God Pan, a musical tinker that upon his kettle drum would play any country dance he called for, and upon holidays had learned money by it, when no fiddler could be heard of. He was only feared when he stalked through some towns where bees were, for he struck so sweetly on the bottom of his copper instrument that he would empty whole hives and lead the swarms after him only by the sound. This excellent, egregious tinker calls for his draught, being a double jug. It was filled for him, but before it came to his nose, the lamentable tale of the Londoner was told. The chamber door, where he lay, being thrust open with a long pole, because none durst touch it with their hands, and the tinker bidden, if he had the heart, to go and see if he knew him. The tinker, being not to learn what virtue the medicine had which he held at his lips, powdered it down his throat merrily, and crying, "Trillill, he fears no plagues," in he stepped, tossing the body to and fro, and was sorry he knew him not. Mine host, with that grief, began to fall away villainously, looking very ruthfully on the tinker, and thinking him a fit instrument to be played upon, offered a crown out of his own purse if he would bury the party. A crown was a shrewd temptation to a tinker. Many a hole might he stop before he could pick a crown of it. Yet being a subtle tinker, and to make all sextons pray for him because he would raise their fees, an angel he wanted to be his guide, and under 10 shillings by his 10 bones he would not put his finger into the fire. The whole parish had warning of this presently. 30 shillings was saved by the bargain, and the town like to be saved too, Therefore 10 shillings was levied out of hand, put into a rag which was tied to the end of a long pole, and delivered, in sight of all the parish, who stood aloof, stopping their noses, by Hedborough's own self in proper person, to the tinker, who with one hand received the money, and with the other struck the board, crying, "Hey, a fresh double pot!" What armour of proof being fitted to his body, he hoists the Londoner on his back like a schoolboy, a shovel and pickaxe standing ready for him, and thus furnished into a field some good distance from the town, he bears his deadly load, and there throws it down, falling roundly to his tools, upon which the strong beer having set an edge, they quickly cut out a lodging in the earth for the citizen. But the tinker, knowing that worms needed no apparel, saving only sheets, stripped him stark naked, but first divided nimbly into his pocket to see what linings they had, assuring himself that a Londoner would not wander so far without his silver. His hopes were of the right stamp, for from out of his pockets he drew a leathern bag with £7 in it. This music made the tinker's heart dance. He quietly tumbled his man into the grave, hit him over the head and ears in dust, bound him up his clothes in a bundle, and carried that at the end of his staff on his shoulder, with the purse of £7 in his hand. Back again he comes through the town, crying aloud, "Have you any more Londoners to bury? Hey, down, a down, Derry, have you any more Londoners to bury?" The Hobbinols running away from him as if he had been the dead citizen's ghost, and he marching away from them in all the haste he could, with the song still in his mouth. You see, therefore, how dreadful a fellow is, making fools even of wise men, and cowards of the most valiant. Yea, in such a base slavery hath it bound men's senses that they have no power to look higher than their own roofs, but seem by their Turkish and barbarous actions to believe that there is no felicity after this life, and that, like beasts, their soul shall perish with their bodies. How many, upon sight only of a letter sent from London, have started back, and durst have laid their salvation upon it, that the plague might be folded in that empty paper, believing verily that the arm of omnipotence could never reach them, unless it were with some weapon drawn out of the infected city. Insomuch that even the western pugs received money there, have tied it in a bag at the end of their barge, and so trailed it through the Thames, lest plague sores sticking upon shillings they should be nailed up for counterfeits when they were brought home. More venturous than these blockheads was a certain justice of peace, to whose gate being shut, for you must know that now there is no open house kept, a company of wild fellows being led for robbing of an orchard, the stout-hearted constable rapped most courageously, and would have with none but the justice himself, who at last appeared in his likeness above at a window, inquiring why they summoned a parley. It was delivered why. The case was opened to his examining wisdom, and that the evildoers were only Londoners. At the name of Londoners, the justice, clapping his hands on his breast, as who should say, "Lord have mercy upon us," started back, and being wise enough to save one, held his nose hard between his forefinger and his thumb, and speaking in that wise, like the fellow that described the villainous motion of Julius Caesar and the Duke of Guise, who, as he gave it out, for to combat together, pulling the casement close to him, cried out in that quail pipe of his, that if they were Londoners, away with them to Limbo. Take only their names. They were sore fellows, and he would deal with them when time should serve. Meaning when the plague and they should not be so great together. And so they departed. The very name of Londoners being worse than 10 whetstones to sharpen the sword of justice against them. I could fill a large volume and call it the second part of the 100 Merry Tales, only with such ridiculous stuff as this of the justice, but I, Meloria, I have better matters to set my wits about. Neither shall you wring out of my pen, though you lay it on the rack, the villainies of that damned keeper who killed all she kept. It had been good to have made her keeper of the common jail, and the holes of both counters, for a number that lie there, that wish to be rid out of this motley world. She would have tickled them, and turned them over the thumbs. I will likewise let the churchwarden in Thames Street sleep, for he's now past waking, who being requested by one of his neighbours to suffer his wife or child that was then dead to lie in the churchyard, he answered in a mocking sort that he kept that lodging for himself and his household, and within 3 days after this striven to hide his head in a hole himself. Neither will I speak a word of a poor boy, servant to a chandler, dwelling thereabouts, who being struck to the heart by sickness was first carried away by water to be left anywhere, but landing being denied by an army of brown billmen that kept the shore, back again was he brought, and left in an outcellar, where lying, grovelling, and groaning on his face, amongst faggots, but not one of the set on fire to comfort him, there continued all night, and died miserably for want of succour. Nor of another poor wretch in the parish of St. Mary Overeyes, who, being in the morning thrown, as the fashion is, into a grave upon a heap of carcasses that keyed for their complement, was found in the afternoon gasping and gaping for life. But by these tricks, imagining that many 1,000 have been turned wrongfully off the ladder of life, and praying that Dekker or his executors may live to do those a good turn, that have done so to others. Hic finis prim armi, here's an end of an old song. And thus ends The Wonderful Year by Thomas Dekker, 1603. So many things in that are interesting and appropriate today, as well as interesting little nuggets. So he mentioned at the end he could fill a volume with stories. A second 100 Merry Tales was a jest book written in the a good 70, 80 years prior to this by John Rastall, and was a very popular book of comic stories. It is available. You can buy it online on Amazon. And they do contain many fun stories, and created a trend for creating jest books essentially being sort of the toilet book of their day. Lots of short, amusing stories. And in a sense, the stories I've been doing today are very much along those lines, a collection of witty and amusing stories, allegedly heard on the wind, many of which are almost certainly not true. I do like the return of the word hobby-noles again for country folk, as it were, and the idea that during a time of plague, you're running away from anyone from London, which, considering the infection rates we're in at the moment, and the propensity of people today to blame a principality for a disease, seems to be a common human error that fools get involved with. So lots and lots of things there. Again, constantly referring to the world of the theatre. Dekker mentions Geronimo, or Hieronymo. So that's the Spanish tragedy, still a popular play at this time, and the idea of calling out for revenge is something that the then modern reader would have been very, very aware of. So these are all talking about things that are in common currency then, which sometimes fall at the wayside. Plays referencing plays that would have been relatively recent at the time. So mentions of Julius Caesar there, and Duke of Guise, which might be Massacre of Paris, might be another Guise play. Other Guise play, I think off the top of my head, are available. I could be wrong there actually. The idea of going into a pub and you get your can of a cake and a can. I like that. So you've got your pewter mug or something along those lines, I assume. I don't really know that. Smelling a voice there. That's another one. Oh, treacherous linen. I apologise if I didn't quite get the adulterous wife sequence quite right at the beginning, but there's an awful lot of innuendo in there. A little bit of misogyny. I think we have to. I should probably have put a warning in there. I had forgotten that he's a little. In his archness, just steps, I think, across the line a bit in being just a little more unpleasant there than witty. A bit of punching down there, I think, going on. But on the whole, a very lively selection of stories. And again, it's impossible at the moment to do it, but I can see very much creating a live show based on this material. A lot of trims and tidying up. Occasionally, I admit, and I occasionally added in the odd word there deliberately as opposed to just cocking up. Where it's not always clear which of the protagonists you're talking about in a story, but with a very few tweaks, this is just so alive as a text. I absolutely love it, and just like to thank Professor Tracy Hill for suggesting this on Twitter the other week, and I sort of leapt upon it with both hands. So tomorrow it is Kemp's 9 Days Wonder. I'm going to do that in the evening so that we can try and catch people over on the other side of the pond, as it were, and also just because I'm not available at lunchtime. So that's Kemp's 9 Days Wonder, performed in a dance from London to Norwich, containing the pleasure, pains, and kind entertainment of William Kemp between London and that city. So that's a really fun one. That's another sort of hour turnover show, but that's the complete text, which I've been playing around with for quite a long time. I've actually not been releasing an audio version of that simply because there's been a touring play that's been touching on Kemp over the last year or so. So I've sort of been holding off, and now seems the time to utilise the work I've done on it so far. And all of the text I'm doing, at some point there will be a proper recording that we'll put out on the podcast. The Wonderful Year by Thomas Dekker should come out in next week if I really pull my skits together. I have already recorded the whole thing. I won't probably use this live recording. These live recordings will remain up because they're sort of slightly more dynamic. Perhaps there will be, as I say, a more accurate and tidy full version to come to the podcast. Hopefully, as I say, next week. It's mostly edited. There's a lot of pickups to do. It is a very technical challenge trying to do live early modern prose. There's some very long sentences, lots of subordinate clauses, lots of dancing around, and it's very easy to go down the wrong alley. So apologies there if occasional bits got a bit mangled, but that's the nature of doing it live, and I hope that the energy that I'm able to give it to you is compensation. Otherwise, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, assuming that this recording has gone well and the live streaming has gone well, I will be available then. Have a lovely rest of your day and stay safe and keep carrying on.